So I wanted you to do something really quick. Just place your hand on the back of your neck right now. Just reach back and feel the base of your skull.
Okay, doing it.
You feel the muscle, right? You feel the vertebrae, the curve where your head actually meets your spine. Now, I want you to ask yourself a very dark, very mechanical question. Is there any physical structure back there, any bone density, any natural protrusion that is capable of supporting the entire dead weight of your body?
Wow. That's a morbid thought experiment.
It really is. But in a book published in 2026, a historian actually used that exact anatomical fact to try and dismantle one of the most gruesome, widely accepted atrocity narratives of the Second World War.
It's just such an incredibly confronting way to approach history because, we usually think of historical research as this process of reading archives, right? Comparing dates.
Right. Dusty books.
Exactly. But treating historical memory like a forensic crime scene, examining the sheer physics of an alleged event, that completely changes the landscape of how we understand the past.
It totally does. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we are taking you into some of the most contentious, sensitive, and honestly, fiercely debated historical territory imaginable. We're exploring a highly controversial text. It's called The Slaughterhouse Massacre, The Anatomy of an Abomination, and it was written by Cornelio Montiano.
And look, before we go a single step further, we absolutely must issue a crucial disclaimer to you, the listener. The source material we are examining today contains highly politically charged content.
Very charged.
It delves deeply into Holocaust revisionism, and it presents extremely controversial historical perspectives regarding the events of January 1941 in Bucharest, Romania, which is commonly known as the Legionary Rebellion.
Yeah, and I want to be absolutely crystal clear up front here. We are not taking any sides. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, Cornelio Montiano, and we are not endorsing the original source material.
Right. Our mission for this deep dive is strictly to impartially report on the content that's been provided to us in this text. We're here to unpack his arguments, examine his methodology, and just understand exactly how he attempts to deconstruct a widely accepted historical narrative.
Exactly. So with that baseline established, Montiano's book has a laser-focused mission, right? He wants to completely dismantle one singular, horrifying historical claim.
Just one specific event.
Yeah. The established narrative that during that 1941 unrest in Bucharest, Jewish victims were hung on butcher's hooks at the municipal slaughterhouse.
It's an infamous story.
It is. And we are going to explore his forensic, historiographical, and logistical arguments against that specific event. So let's start with the official story, because to understand why he's attacking this, you kind of have to understand the sheer weight of the official narrative. He starts by quoting directly from the final report of the International Commission for the Study of the Holocaust in Romania. So what exactly does that official report claim?
So the official report states that on the last day of the rebellion, which is January 23, 1941, 15 Jews were taken from the police prefecture right in the center of Bucharest and transported across town to the city Slaughterhouse.
Okay.
And according to the report, these 15 individuals were tortured, shot, and then hung by the neck on butcher's hooks. And the report specifically emphasizes that some were hung while still alive.
Ugh.
Yeah. And that the killers attached signs to their bodies reading kosher meat.
It's just deeply horrific, nightmare-inducing image. I mean, it's the kind of detail that just burns itself into the collective memory.
Yeah.
But Montiano immediately throws up a massive stop sign here. He doesn't even start by looking at the documents. He starts by looking at a map.
A map and a military timeline, yeah.
Right. And this is where I realized I needed a quick refresher, because context is everything. What was actually happening in Bucharest on January 23, 1941, this wasn't just, a normal Tuesday with some minor rioting.
Not at all. To understand his first argument, you really have to visualize the chaos of Bucharest in that exact moment. This was the climax of the Legionary Rebellion. The Legionaries, which, just for context, was this fascist, fiercely anti-Semitic paramilitary group in Romania, sometimes called the Iron Guard. They had essentially turned against the government of General Ion Antonescu.
They barricaded themselves in.
Right. They barricaded themselves inside key government buildings across the city, including that police prefecture. But by January 23, the tide had completely turned. Antonescu had ordered the regular Romanian army to just crush the rebellion, so the prefecture was entirely surrounded by the military.
And when we say surrounded by the military, we aren't talking about a few beat cops with, wooden batons. Montiano pulls from the archives to point out the actual hardware on the streets.
Oh yeah, heavy machinery.
The Romanian army had deployed Renault R-35 tank, it's literally tanks, along with heavy artillery and light machine gun battalions. The building was under a massive, heavily armed military siege. Meanwhile, the legionaries inside were essentially just a paramilitary mob.
Poorly armed, trapped.
Yeah, carrying mostly pistols, maybe some hunting rifles. They were totally boxed in.
Which brings us to Munteanu's first major point of contention, which is the sheer macroscopic logistics of this alleged crime. He argues that the official narrative requires us to believe something that is just physically impossible.
Because of the siege?
Exactly. We are supposed to believe that these besieged, heavily outgunned, totally panicked legionaries somehow managed to casually smuggle 15 civilian prisoners out of a completely surrounded building, past battalions of regular army troops and tanks.
Right. And not just sneak them out, but load them onto some sort of transport vehicle, drive them across a city that is functioning as an active volatile war zone, arrive at the municipal slaughterhouse, and then calmly conduct a highly complex, protracted torture and execution session.
It defies logic, according to him.
Munteanu argues it fundamentally defies the physical reality of a military siege. And on top of that, he highlights official military logs showing that the legionaries inside the prefecture had actually agreed to surrender by the evening of January 22. So by the morning of the 23rd, they were actively being disarmed, marched out with their hands up, and taken to Malmaison prison.
So his argument is that the timeline and the military geography simply do not allow a window for this highly organized atrocity trip to even occur.
Right.
But what's truly fascinating is how he transitions from this macroscopic view of troop movements down to the microscopic physical mechanics of the hanging itself.
Yes. This is where we get back to that anatomical thought experiment I had you do at the start. Munteanu treats this like a forensic cold case. He claims to have meticulously studied 3D human skull models for this section of the book.
Which is an intense level of dedication to debunking this.
It is. And he points out that human anatomy completely lacks a structural anchor point at the back of the neck, or the base of the skull.
Right, because if you attempt to hang a human body weighing, say, 150 or 160 pounds from the back of the neck on a meat hook, the physics just fail.
They completely fail.
The flesh, the muscle, the cervical ligaments, they would simply tear. The hook would rip right through. There is no biological way for the neck to support the dead weight of a body in that manner.
I have to admit, when I first read this part, I was really taken aback by the clinical detachment of it. But from a purely mechanical standpoint, he makes an arresting argument. He states that to artificially create a hole capable of supporting that kind of weight on a hook, you would have to drill directly into the heavy bone at the base of the skull, the occipital bone.
Wow.
And to do that, you would need specialized heavy-duty surgical or industrial tools, like a bone drill or a trepan.
Precisely. And so Munteanu asks the reader to logically assess the situation. Do we really believe that a desperate fleeing paramilitary mob who were under active artillery fire carried heavy surgical drilling equipment with them to a slaughterhouse?
Just casually lugging a bone drill through a war zone?
Right. And even more critically, he points out a massive logical paradox in the official report. Because remember, the official commission claims that some of the victims were hung on these hooks while still alive.
Which is physically irreconcilable. I mean, if you have to drill a massive hole into the base of a human skull, directly into the brainstem and the upper spinal cord, just to anchor a hook, the victim is instantly dead.
Instantly.
You cannot biologically be hung alive by the base of your skull. The medical reality just completely contradicts the official text.
And Munteanu doesn't stop at human anatomy either. He turns his attention to the anatomy of the slaughterhouse hooks themselves. He notes that industrial butcher hooks have retained essentially the exact same utilitarian design for centuries.
They haven't changed.
Right, because they are explicitly engineered for one specific purpose, to hang non-human animals upside down.
Right, they're designed to pierce the thick hind leg tendons of a quadruped. It's basically the equivalent of a human Achilles tendon, and they have a very specific curvature to allow a heavy carcass to be hoisted up so the animal can bleed out.
Right from a neck incision.
Yeah. Munteanu argues that the physical shape, the gauge, the curvature of a standard butcher's hook categorically precludes hanging a human by the neck. It's just the wrong tool for the horrific job described.
So if we synthesize part one of his book, he isn't even asking why the atrocity happened yet. He's looking at the crime scene and stating that the physics, the biology, the military logistics, the hardware, none of it aligns. He concludes that the event, as described in the official record, is a physical impossibility.
Okay, so we have this glaring physical impossibility. Meat hooks do not work on human necks. But that leaves us with a massive psychological and academic problem, right?
Oh, totally.
If it's physically impossible, how did it end up in the official international historical record? You don't just accidentally invent a detail that's specific and that gruesome out of thin air. There has to be a paper trail.
And finding that paper trail is exactly what Munteanu sets out to do next. If the physics don't add up, he has to deconstruct the historiography.
The citations.
Exactly. He traces the citations backward. He looks at works by prominent Holocaust historians like Jean Ansel. He looks at the official Holocaust Commission's final report, and he asks a simple question. What is the root source they are all citing?
And what he finds is what he calls a single point of failure. He traces almost all of this authoritative historical weight back to one specific article in a Romanian newspaper. It was called Journalul de Dimine, the Morning Journal, specifically issue number 57.
And the date is key here.
Yes, the date on this publication is crucial. It was published on January 24, 1945.
Let's contextualize that date for a moment because it is everything to his argument. The events at the slaughterhouse supposedly took place in late January 1941. This foundational newspaper article is published exactly 4 years later in January 1945. What is happening in Romania in early 1945?
It is a completely different world.
Yeah.
The war is ending and the Soviet Red Army is actively occupying Romania. The old political guard is being totally dismantled and the communist-backed authorities are consolidating absolute power.
It's a massive shift.
Huge. They are setting up the so-called people's courts to try wartime officials. It is a highly volatile, highly propagandized, ruthlessly controlled media environment.
Exactly. And the author of this 1945 article is a man named I.N. Vladescu. In the text of the article, Vladescu claims to be a reserve military captain and a military prosecutor who was personally appointed by General Antonescu back in 1941 to investigate the Slaughterhouse Massacre.
So he's saying he was there.
Right. Essentially, he is presenting himself to the 1945 public as the ultimate insider whistleblower.
But Munteanu absolutely shreds Vladescu's credibility. First, he attacks the man's credentials structurally. He points out that a reserve captain drafted from civilian life who is practically just a civilian lawyer could not possibly hold the title of a military prosecutor.
It doesn't work that way.
Right. Military prosecution is not a temporary gig. It's a strictly specialized military rank requiring advanced degrees in military science, military law, criminalistics. Munteanu argues that the Romanian army simply did not hand that title to civilian reserve officers. Vladescu was, in Munteanu's eyes, just inflating his resume to sound authoritative.
But the credential issue is really just the appetizer here. Munteanu's main course is a textual analysis of the article itself. He argues that if Vladescu was truly a seasoned military prosecutor delivering a factual report of a crime scene, the prose would reflect that.
It would be clinical.
Exactly. Objective, meticulously detailed regarding forensics. Instead, Munteanu notes the article reads like cheap, sensationalist pulp fiction.
It really does. Munteanu quotes the language Vladescu uses, and it is incredibly lurid. Vladescu writes about the perpetrators drilling breasts. He uses these bizarre, almost voyeuristic anatomical terms like using the French-derived word memelles instead of standard clinical terminology.
It's so weird.
It is. He describes the killers as masters in the art of torment, who are busy tying intestines like ties. Munteanu argues that this is not the language of a legal professional cataloging evidence. This is the language of a pulp novelist trying to elicit a visceral, emotional reaction from a newspaper reader.
Because of the timing arriving 4 years later, right as the Soviets are establishing power, combined with those dubious credentials and the highly sensationalized tone, Munteanu draws a hard conclusion. He suspects that this article was not a genuine historical account.
He thinks it's planted, right?
Yes. He believes it was a deliberate fabrication, likely planted by Soviet or communist operatives in the press to incite immense public anger against the former regime, which would thereby justify the brutal political purges that were taking place in 1945.
It's essentially the 1940s equivalent of, like, circular reporting on Wikipedia or social media today. A politically motivated tabloid prints a highly sensationalized rumor. Then, a respected historian quotes the tabloid in a footnote. 10 years later, another historian quotes the first historian's footnote, just assuming it's solid.
And it builds and builds.
Suddenly, the tabloid rumor has the impenetrable armor of a peer-reviewed academic citation, and the original, highly flawed source is completely buried under layers of academic legitimacy.
That is precisely the mechanism Munteanu identifies. And he finds a perfect, glaring example of this in one of the most foundational texts of the Romanian Holocaust. The Black Book.
Right, Matesius Karp's book.
Yes. This was a monumental, multi-volume work published between 1946 and 1948, meticulously chronicling the suffering of Romanian Jews.
And this is where Munteanu's close reading really pays off, because he finds a massive, seemingly unexplainable contradiction within Karp's own book. In the main body text of the Black Book, Karp provides a very specific account of the 15 victims at the slaughterhouse. Karp writes that they were taken to the slaughterhouse fence, lined up, shot in the head, and Munteanu highlights this, quote, "the killers left."
So, a straightforward, albeit tragic, firing squad execution.
Exactly. But then, Munteanu points the reader to a footnote on that exact same page. In the footnote, Karp quotes the Vladescu newspaper article. The footnote contains the entire gruesome narrative about the victims being hung on hooks, their bellies slit open, their intestines tied like a bow tie.
So Munteanu asks the obvious glaring question here. If the main text explicitly states that the killers shot the victims and left immediately, who hung them up on the hooks?
Right. Did the execution squad leave, get halfway down the street, suddenly remember they forgot to perform a complex hanging ritual, and turn around?
It makes no sense.
Munteanu argues that this contradiction suggests Matatias Karp himself probably didn't fully believe the hook story. He knew they were shot. But perhaps feeling the political pressure of the era, or just wanting to include every available horrific detail, he shoved the newspaper quote into a footnote, inadvertently creating a massive logical paradox in his own definitive history.
And Munteanu views this as absolute proof of information laundering. The historical establishment took a single, highly suspect, politically motivated article from 1945 and cited it so frequently and so authoritatively that it morphed into unquestionable historical fact through sheer repetition.
Okay, so he's attacked the physics and he's attacked the paper trail. But I'm putting myself in the shoes of a skeptical reader here.
Always a good idea.
Even if the official document is flawed, what about the people standing there? What about the eyewitnesses? If a massacre happens in a major municipal building, people see it. How does Munteanu handle the people who claim to be there?
Well, he treats the eyewitness testimonies with the exact same aggressive skepticism he applied to the documents. He systematically attacks their credibility, but more importantly, he maps out how the testimonies contradict one another, demonstrating how a localized rumor evolved into a monstrous myth.
It's like watching an urban legend mutate in real time. Every time the story gets retold, it gains a new, increasingly gruesome detail.
Exactly. Let's trace his timeline of the whispers. Munteanu finds the very first concrete, written mention of the slaughterhouse in a letter dated March 1941, just a few weeks after the rebellion. It's a letter sent to Moscow by a communist operative operating under the pseudonym Comrade Zimmer.
Okay, so very early on.
Right. Now, Zimmer's letter does mention Jews being hung on hooks, where cattle were slaughtered. It's the origin seed of the story. But crucially, Munteanu points out what Zimmer doesn't say. Zimmer doesn't say anything about them being hung by the back of the neck. He doesn't mention the kosher meat signs. And he certainly doesn't mention intestines tied into bow ties. It's just a raw claim of hanging.
Got it.
Then we move forward slightly to 1942. Munteanu looks at a book called Athene Palace, written by Countess Rosie G. Waldeck. She was an American journalist stationed in Bucharest during the unrest. She writes about the slaughterhouse, but Munteanu applies strict source criticism here.
Because she wasn't at the slaughterhouse.
Right. He notes that during the violence, she was largely confined to the safety of her luxury hotel. She was repeating hotel lobby gossip, not providing firsthand sworn eyewitness testimony. But interestingly, her version of the rumor states they were hung like pork legs.
Meaning hung upside down by the feet.
Yes, which anatomically actually makes more physical sense than the neck. And she is the first to introduce the detail of the kosher signs.
So within a year, the story has evolved from a basic hanging to being hung upside down with signs. Then we move into the post-war accounts, and the details start fracturing wildly. Mihail Sebastian, a famous Jewish writer who kept a meticulous diary during this time, mentions rumors of the slaughterhouse, but his version says they were hung by the throat.
Completely different mechanism. And contrast that with the account of Philip Brunier-Fox, a prominent investigative journalist. Brunier-Fox actually claimed to have gone to the city morgue on January 24th, the day after the alleged event, and seen the bodies of the victims brought from the slaughterhouse.
Okay, so an actual eyewitness to the bodies.
Yes, but his first-hand visual description completely shatters the official narrative.
Right, because Brunier-Fox describes seeing a pile of about 20 bodies, but he describes them as elderly men. And crucially, he explicitly notes that they were fully clothed, except for their boots, which had been stolen by looters. He mentions their pants were unbuttoned supposedly by the killers to verify their circumcision and ethnicity, but they still had their clothes on.
Fully clothed. But then you cross-reference that with another writer, Constantin Virgil Georgiou. He also wrote about the slaughterhouse victims, but he claimed they were completely naked so that the word kosher could be carved or written on their flesh.
So if you are a historian looking at these accounts, you have victims who are simultaneously fully clothed elderly men and completely naked people. They are hung by the feet like pork legs, they are hung by the throat, and they are hung by the back of the neck.
It's all over the place.
Munteanu argues it is a totally contradictory mess.
And Munteanu reserves his harshest criticism for late-in-life testimonies that emerged decades after the fact. He highlights an interview given in 2012 by Mircea Albulescu, a very famous, beloved Romanian actor.
This testimony is wild, and Munteanu really goes after it. Because in 2012, Albulescu publicly claimed that he saw the Jews hanging on the hooks at the slaughterhouse with his own eyes, the glaring catch. Albulescu was 6 years old in January 1941.
6.
Yeah. Munteanu asks the reader to suspend all disbelief here. Are we really supposed to believe that a 6-year-old boy wandered completely alone across a sprawling capital city that was under an active military siege, strolled past army cordons into an active municipal slaughterhouse, witnessed one of the most horrific massacres of the century, and then just quietly walked back home?
It strains credulity.
He dismisses it entirely. He suggests it's either a deeply implanted false memory or just a blatant lie told for dramatic attention.
He also heavily scrutinizes the testimony of a man named Baruch Cohen, who claimed to have seen the hanging bodies. But Cohen's details are fundamentally flawed, according to Munteanu's timeline. Cohen claimed he saw the bodies hanging at a butcher shop, plural, out in the city, not the centralized municipal slaughterhouse.
A totally different location.
And furthermore, Cohen claimed he was sent out to look for his family members on the day after the rebellion was entirely quelled. But Munteanu proves, using the morgue records and Brunea Fox's own account, that by that date, the bodies had already been collected and moved to the city morgue. They weren't hanging anywhere.
I have to pause here because this is where the historiography gets really tricky for me. Memory is incredibly fallible, right? Especially traumatic memory. People misremember details of car crashes that happened 10 minutes ago. So how do historians usually handle eyewitness accounts that contradict each other this wildly? Does a contradiction mean the whole event is a lie, or just that human memory is messy?
That is one of the most profound challenges in the historical profession. Historians usually look for overlapping consensus. Like, if 10 people witness a bank robbery, they might disagree on the color of the getaway car, but they will all agree a robbery happened.
Right.
You also weigh the proximity of the witness. Were they actually in the room, or did they hear it from a cousin? Munteanu's core argument is that regarding the slaughterhouse hooks, there is no overlapping consensus.
The core details don't match.
The core physical details, how they were hung, what they were wearing, where it happened, contradict each other fundamentally. And more importantly, almost none of the early sources actually claim to have been standing in the room. They report it as a terrifying rumor sweeping through the city.
Which brings us to the next massive pillar of Munteanu's argument. The dog that didn't bark. He's dismantled the physical logic, he's discredited the 1945 origin document, and he's pointed out the glaring contradictions in the eyewitness rumors. Now, he pivots to what isn't there.
The absence of evidence.
Yes, he focuses on the profound absence of hard evidence.
And in historical research, the absence of evidence, especially when evidence should logically exist given the circumstances, can be highly revealing. Munteanu focuses extensively on the complete lack of photographic proof.
He points out a stark reality. Despite over 70 years passing, despite massive archives being opened up after the fall of communism, and despite widespread, persistent rumors that photographs of the event were taken, not a single verified image of bodies on hooks at the Bucharest slaughterhouse has ever surfaced anywhere in the world.
He specifically addresses the historical rumors regarding espionage. It was widely whispered that German spies, like the infamous Edith von Koller, or communist operatives, like the aforementioned Comrade Zimmer, took photos for their respective intelligence agencies.
Didn't Zimmer say he sent photos?
Yes, Zimmer even explicitly stated in his 1941 letter that he was sending photographic evidence to Moscow. Yet those photos have never materialized in Russian, German, or Romanian archives.
Now, to play devil's advocate here, and I think it's important we are talking about an active war zone. Looting a shop is one thing. Sneaking a bulky 1930s camera into an active municipal slaughterhouse to photograph a clandestine execution is entirely different. Does the mere absence of photos actually prove a negative? Or is Munteanu relying too heavily on circumstantial silence? Couldn't the killers have just confiscated the cameras?
That is a very valid counterargument, and it's the standard defense against his claim. However, Munteanu anticipates this. He counters by proving that cameras were absolutely present and active in the streets of Bucharest during the rebellion.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he points to a trove of contemporary color photographs taken by a German photographer named Willy Prager.
Right. Munteanu brings the receipts here. Prager's photos clearly and undeniably show the aftermath of the rebellion in the Jewish neighborhoods of Makaratayek and Dudati. They show devastated shops, shattered windows, looted businesses. Munteanu freely admits these photos prove unequivocally that there was massive violence, chaos, and targeted destructive looting of Jewish property by the mobs.
But his point is this. Amongst all those photos proving the chaos of the streets, there are 0 photos of the slaughterhouse hooks. Munteanu makes a very cynical but politically logical point. He argues that if photographs of such a uniquely, viscerally barbaric act existed, they would have been weaponized immediately by the victors.
Absolutely.
The communist prosecutors in 1945 were desperate for visual propaganda to convict the former fascist regime and legitimize their own takeover. If they had a photo of a human being on a meat hook, they would have plastered it on the front page of every newspaper in Eastern Europe.
It would have been everywhere.
The fact that they didn't, Munteanu argues, strongly suggests the photos simply do not exist.
But Munteanu doesn't just rely on the absence of photos to make his case. He claims to have found actual, hard documentary evidence of innocence. Evidence that he claims has been actively and deliberately ignored by mainstream Holocaust historians. He introduces this massive archival discovery made by Professor Radu Iftimovici, who is a recognized historian of medicine.
This is a huge piece of the puzzle. Iftimovici dug deep into the post-war archives and brought to light that in 1946, the Communist Prosecutor's Office actually opened an official, formal investigation into the alleged Slaughterhouse Massacre.
A real legal probe.
Yes, this wasn't a cursory glance. They interrogated the slaughterhouse employees, the technicians, the director who was in charge back in 1941, and the result of that official state investigation. They found absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all.
No forensic evidence, no corroborating testimony, no convictions. The case was quietly closed due to a complete lack of evidence.
Which is absolutely astounding when you consider the terrifying political climate of 1946 Romania. The communist authorities were handing down harsh prison sentences and death penalties in show trials on basically an assembly line basis. The burden of proof was incredibly low.
Non-existent, almost.
Right. If there was even a microscopic shred of evidence, or even a coerced confession to convict the slaughterhouse staff of complicity in fascist war crimes, the prosecutors would have gleefully used it. The fact that even a communist show trial apparatus couldn't make the charges stick is a massive red flag for Munteanu.
And Munteanu presents an even more direct, personal piece of counter-evidence. A written, formal denial from 1946, signed by 37 actual employees of the municipal slaughterhouse.
37 of them.
Yeah. And these weren't politicians. These were the veterinarians, the sanitary technicians, the janitors, and the shift managers who worked on the floor during the days of the rebellion. In this sworn document, they categorically refute the press rumors of a massacre taking place inside their facility.
What do they say exactly?
They explicitly call the allegations pure fantasy. They argue that a massacre of that scale would have entirely disrupted the strict sanitary and operational protocols of a major industrial facility, and it simply did not happen on their watch.
And Munteanu expresses profound, palpable outrage that the International Commission for the Study of the Holocaust in Romania, the body that wrote the definitive official narrative, completely omitted both the 1946 Communist prosecutors' investigation and the signed 37 employee denial from their final report.
He essentially accuses the historical establishment of blatant cherry-picking. He claims they elevate a highly suspect, sensationalist newspaper article from 1945 to the sacred status of unquestionable historical fact because it perfectly fits a predetermined narrative of ultimate demonic cruelty,
while ignoring the exculpatory evidence.
Meanwhile, they actively suppress official exculpatory archival documents from the exact same time period because those documents complicate the narrative.
It's a severe accusation of academic malpractice. Munteanu is arguing that the Holocaust Commission did not act as objective, impartial investigators following the evidence wherever it leads, but rather acted as prosecutors building a specific, unassailable case, deliberately ignoring any evidence that didn't fit the brief.
Okay, so we've gone deep into the weeds of the Slaughterhouse event. We've looked at the physics, the paper trail, the witnesses, the archives. But we have to ask the broader question here. What does this all actually mean? Munteanu has written an entire book about one specific detail of a much larger conflict.
Right.
He isn't just trying to correct a footnote in a niche history book. He believes this localized debate about meat hooks connects to a much broader, much more significant issue regarding how the entire history of the Romanian Holocaust is constructed and, in his view, weaponized in the modern day.
Yes, this is where we reach part 5, where Munteanu reveals his overarching thesis. And I want to be extremely careful and clear here regarding his stance on the broader tragedy. Munteanu does not deny that innocent Jewish citizens were murdered during the Legionary Rebellion. He is not saying the rebellion was bloodless.
Correct. He accepts that there were innocent victims of political and mob violence. To establish this, he uses Matastius Karp's own published list of victims, and he meticulously cross-references that list with the actual forensic medical certificates issued by the city morgue in 1941.
Yeah, the actual death certificates.
Yes, and those death certificates list specific causes of death, primarily gunshot wounds to the head or chest, consistent with street violence or firing squads. But, crucially, Munteanu notes that not a single medical certificate mentions trauma, lacerations, or skeletal damage consistent with being hung on industrial meat hooks.
Based on this forensic data, Munteanu agrees with the figure that there were 118 identified Jewish victims, plus 2 unidentified bodies, tragically killed during the unrest in Bucharest.
But he draws a very sharp, highly controversial line between acknowledging those 118 specific deaths and accepting the much, much larger macro figures cited by modern mainstream historians. The Holocaust Commission's final report estimates the total number of Romanian and Ukrainian Jewish victims of the Romanian civil and military authorities during the entire war to be between 280,000 and 380,000.
Munteanu aggressively pushes back against those massive figures. He argues they are inflated, and he uses a very specific, highly debated demographic study to make his case. A 1957 study co-authored by Sabin Manuela, who was the former head of the Romanian Statistics Institute, and Wilhelm Filderman.
And Filderman was incredibly significant.
Yeah, he was the actual leader of the Jewish communities in Romania during the war.
Right. And this Filderman-Manuela study is a deeply contentious document in historical circles. According to Munteanu's reading of it, the study suggests that approximately 100,000 Romanian Jews survived the early stages of the war by retreating eastward, crossing the border alongside the Soviet army, when Romanian military forces retook the territories of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina.
Munteanu's argument here is explosive. He claims that modern Holocaust historians deliberately suppress, discredit, or simply ignore this 1957 demographic study. He claims they do this for a very specific reason. If 100,000 Jews survived by retreating with the Soviets, it drastically lowers the number of people who could be statistically classified as victims of the Romanian Holocaust.
It changes the math entirely.
Exactly. He argues that the establishment desperately wants to maintain the narrative of the higher death tolls, and thus, any demographic data that suggests survival is treated as heresy.
He points to the fierce academic and professional backlash against any historian who even attempts to cite that Filderman-Manuela study. He interprets this backlash not as rigorous peer review, but as a coordinated attempt to protect a prefabricated truth, rather than engage in objective, complex demographic debate about wartime population shifts.
And Munteanu doesn't just look at dusty academic journals either. He brings this deep dive directly into the modern digital era. He analyzes how this historical battle is currently being fought and written in real time online.
Wikipedia.
Specifically targeting Wikipedia, yes.
He views Wikipedia as the ultimate modern battleground for historical memory because it's where the general public gets their baseline reality. He painstakingly analyzes the edit histories, the talk pages, and the moderation logs on both the English and Romanian Wikipedia pages concerning the Bucharest pogrom and the Slaughterhouse Massacre.
And what he describes is essentially a digital trench war. He singles out specific power editors, specifically one operating under the handle Ocadem. Munteanu cites documentation from a seminar where Wikipedia editors were allegedly trained to take a, quote, balanced and Zionist approach to editing historical articles. Munteanu accuses editors like Ocadem of aggressively enforcing this ideological approach.
And he details the mechanics of how they do this. He claims these power editors use their administrative privileges to lock articles, preventing anyone else from editing them. They ban dissenting users who try to introduce primary source documents like that 1946 employee denial we talked about.
They just lock them out.
Yes. And most troublingly to Montiano, they actively insert the most gruesome, exaggerated variations of the myth into the main text.
Right. For example, he highlights how the English Wikipedia article evolved to prominently include the story of a 5-year-old girl being hung alive on a meat hook. Montiano points out there is absolutely zero primary source documentation supporting that specific horrific detail in any of the original 1941 or 1945 texts.
It's an escalation of the myth.
Exactly. But when other Wikipedia users challenge this edition and demand primary sources on the talk pages, Montiano claims these power editors simply dismiss the challenges. They rely solely on secondary summaries, like citing a paragraph from the Holocaust Commission report, which itself cites the flawed 1945 newspaper article.
It effectively creates a closed loop of self-referential information that is impenetrable to outside evidence.
It's wild. So Montiano sees this not as an academic disagreement, but as an active, ongoing digital war designed to cement the myth into the global consciousness permanently.
But this raises a really vital, difficult philosophical question, and I struggle with this part of his argument. If Montiano admits that 118 innocent people were murdered, shot in the woods, killed in their homes by mobs, executed at the prefecture fence, why does he care so passionately about debunking the hooks?
That's the big question.
Right. I mean, 118 dead is a horrific, undeniable tragedy. To the modern listener, debating whether they were shot in the head or hung on a meat hook feels almost pedantic, maybe even insensitive. Doesn't the tragedy stand regardless of the specific anatomical mechanism of their death? Why is this the hill he chooses to die on?
That question really gets to the very core of Montiano's motivation for writing the book. He explains that it is entirely about the gruesomeness of the specific myth, and how that unique level of gruesomeness is intentionally weaponized against the national psyche.
How does he define that weaponization exactly?
So Montiano argues that a firing squad, or mob violence during civil unrest, is a terrible, tragic reality of war and fascism. It's horrible, but it falls within the recognizable, historically common parameters of human conflict. Sadly, people shoot each other during rebellions. But hanging innocent people alive on meat hooks, slitting their bellies and labeling them like slaughtered animals, that crosses a line from political violence into a unique, monstrous, almost unimaginably demonic barbarity.
It's the difference between a war crime and an act of sheer psychopathic sadism.
Exactly. And Montiano's core belief is that this specific, hyper-gruesome myth is perpetuated for a deliberate reason. He argues it is maintained not to honor the actual victims or to seek truth, but to induce an unfair, paralyzing sense of collective guilt and historical shame upon the entire Romanian nation.
I see.
He believes that by portraying Romanians not just as participants in wartime violence, but as subhuman sadists capable of unspeakable slaughterhouse atrocities, it permanently damages the national identity. It frames the entire culture as inherently barbaric. And that is why he fights so fiercely to correct this specific detail of the historical record.
So he believes he is defending the fundamental dignity of a nation against a fabricated, sensationalist libel, even while acknowledging the grim reality of the actual documented murders.
Yes.
It is an incredibly fraught, razor-thin line to walk. It requires demanding clinical precision in the midst of historical trauma.
It really does. And that brings us to the end of Montiano's intricate, controversial architecture of doubt. We've traced his arguments from the ground up. We looked at his forensic deconstruction of the physical and logistical impossibilities.
The meat hooks and the skulls.
Yeah. We examined his historiographical attack on the 1945 origin documents and the concept of information laundering. We dissected his analysis of the evolving, contradictory rumors.
We looked at his presentation of suppressed counter-evidence, like the 1946 investigation.
And finally, we explored his overarching theory on the demographic debates and the modern weaponization of the myth on platforms like Wikipedia. It has been a heavy, deeply complex journey. We've essentially watched Montiano treat a deeply sensitive, foundational historical legend like a cold case. He applied physics, source criticism, and a significant amount of outrage to try and dismantle the narrative of the slaughterhouse hooks piece by piece.
And before we wrap up today, I want to briefly remind you, our listener, of the disclaimer we established at the very beginning. We have spent this deep dive mapping out Corneliu Montiano's arguments and exploring his forensic approach to historiography. However, we are not endorsing his political rhetoric, we're not validating his broader views on Holocaust demographics, nor are we taking a definitive side on this highly contested, painful history.
Right. Our goal was simply to unpack the anatomy of his argument as presented in his book. We laid out his case, we explored the mechanisms of his logic, and we debated the implications. But as we step back from the forensics, the skull models, and the dusty archives, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought.
Let's hear it.
We started this deep dive talking about the expectation of precision in history. We expect it to be a clean science. But what happens when history becomes deeply, inextricably intertwined with national identity, with profound generational trauma, and with the heavy, crushing burden of collective guilt?
The lines between fact and feeling blur significantly.
They blur, and the landscape gets murky. How do we, as a society, distinguish between the absolute empirical truth found in a police file and the powerful symbiotic legends we build to express the true, unimaginable horror of the past?
It's complicated.
It is. Sometimes, a gruesome, exaggerated myth might capture the emotional truth of an atrocity for the survivors better than a dry list of gunshot wounds ever could. So, ask yourself this. Can a historian ever successfully analytically debunk a specific horrific detail of a tragedy, like meat hooks in a slaughterhouse, without it being immediately perceived by the survivors and the world as a callous attack on the memory of the tragedy itself? Can we demand clinical anatomical precision from a history born of such immense chaos and pain? Let us know what you think.